late summer of 2013, I landed a position as a trainee at the best motorcycle paint shop in all of North Carolina. Ever since I was around 10 years old, I was obsessed with that show, American Choppers. My older brother was into the mechanical side of things, but to me, the coolest part of the whole process was the paint job, turning these already awesome machines into something that looked like straight-up fantasy. I was living with my parents in Martinsville, Virginia, when I found out that Gleamer's Motorcycle Painting in Charlotte, North Carolina, was advertising what was basically an intern position. For a couple of bucks an hour, I'll help keep the place clean and run smoothly, while learning the tricks of the trade in the process. Then, after about a year when I was all trained up, I'd be offered a full-time and fully paid position. I called the guy and practically begged him for the job. Told him I'd work harder and smarter than anyone else, twice as hard even. I was dropping the names of renowned bike painters who I thought the best manufacturers were, anything I thought might impress the guy. In the end, he only had one question for me. Harleys or sports bikes? I told him Harleys. He told me, "You're hired." 2 weeks later, I make my first drive to Charlotte at 6:30 in the morning. Most I'd ever driven before that was to and from Martinsville Taco Bell, and there I was making this 2-hour trip at the crack of dawn. Luckily, the trip down there went pretty smooth, and apart from the bathroom break that I took around mile 60, it was a straight shot to Charlotte down the I-85 south. But that first day really took it out of me. It wasn't some Marine Corps boot camp or nothing, but the owner and veteran painters definitely wanted to see what I was made of. The point is, I was dead tired by the time I had to drive back. So as you can probably guess, the journey home wasn't nearly as smooth as the drive out there. When I started seeing signs of Mocksville, North Carolina, I realized I must have made a wrong turn back around Salisbury. No big deal, I could just readjust with maybe only a half-hour extra on my journey, and besides that, I was looking to stop somewhere to pick up some food, as there's no way I could wait for the plate my mom had promised to save for me. I get to a place called Clemens, and I start seeing signs for the highway. There was a Cracker Barrel, a Krispy Kreme, a Biscuitville. Oh man, it was like junk food heaven down there. So I pull off, get a fried pork chop biscuit, then started on my journey again. Only by this point, I'm hopelessly lost. My phone is out of battery, and I'm so tired I can't even read the road map that I'm forced to be using now sitting on my passenger seat without fear of causing an accident. So, on account of good old Southern hospitality, I decided to stop to ask someone for directions. But of all the houses to pull up outside, I pulled up outside 2947 Nob Hill Drive. And little do I know, I'm about to have a brush with death where Satan himself has his finger on the trigger. Y'all think I'm exaggerating with that, right? Ain't no such thing as the devil. But in North Carolina, the devil was just as real as I am surely breathing, and his name was Pazuzu. First thing I noticed about this house is that there were these 2 punk girls sat outside on the front lawn. They were both real cute, sitting there, smoking cigarettes, so I figured, who better to ask? I could start a little conversation, maybe drop that I painted motorcycles for a living, see if I could get a phone number or two. Turns out neither girl was actually from Clemens. They'd come all the way down from Ohio to hang out for a while. That struck me as kind of weird, driving like 7 or 8 hours just to hang out, but still, I just carried on asking if anyone could point me in the direction of the highway. One of the girls said I was welcome to come inside the house, as there had to be at least one person in there who knew, even if they had to find Pazuzu. Pazuzu. I'd never heard that word in my life before that day, and honestly it sounded more like something you'd call a cat than a person. And I don't really pay it no mind as I follow them across the lawn and up the front door of the house. The second thing that strikes me is all the creepy looking decorations on the front door. It was like a Halloween skull in there, weird quotes from movies or books, and a bumper sticker that said, "Evil will triumph." It looked like the front door to Hell's frat house, like a total punk rock crash pad, and at first, let me tell you, I was about it. I mean, I was a little taken aback by the historical German memorabilia, if you get my drift, on the ceiling as I walked inside. But there was all kinds of nonsense that was all over the walls. All sorts of weird symbols. Stuff in crazy writing that sort of looked Arabic, I guess you could say. And look at it this way. I knew whoever had drawn it just wanted to be shocking or edgy. It's not like they were a house full of Nazis or whatever. 'Cause that's what I mean about the crash pad thing. The place was filthy and it stunk to high heaven. But as long as I could just get directions and then get out of there, I didn't pay the stink no mind. So I carried on through the house. This place was just a sensory overload. Because not only does it reek and the decoration is practically schizophrenic, but I can barely hear myself think over the black metal they had blasting. As I walk into the TV room, there's a bunch more people hanging out, smoking and drinking, pentagrams everywhere, all kind of messed up pictures on the wall. One was this really nice framed picture of what looked like a body at a crime scene. Another thing I noticed was a big tank with red lights, like an empty fish tank, and the thing has like a bunch of huge tarantulas in it. That was actually kind of dope now that you mention it. But that's about as good as it got, because the next thing I know, as I'm following these two girls deeper and deeper into the house, the bad smell goes from, "Dude, you need to clean up," to, "Did something die in here?" The two girls then lead me into the kitchen and through another room with yet another animal habitat in it. Only this time, instead of spiders, the tank was full of snakes. I say full, there were maybe only 4 or 5 in there of varying sizes. But dude, I ain't never seen anyone keep no snake as a freaking pet. Where I'm from, that'd be considered downright satanic, and definitely weird. But not only does this house have a tank full of them, but some random dude is sitting on a table with one of them right there in front of him. The girls start talking to this guy, and when he turns, I can see he's in a not-so-fit state to be talking to anyone. His pupils were like little holes in the snow, like this guy was as high as a freaking kite. They called him by a name that I won't even try and repeat here, obviously a nickname, but the thing was just a combo of practically every top-tier curse word you can think of. But this guy was just out of it. And since he was one of the locals that could have helped me, we had to look elsewhere. But just before we left the room, I peered around the guy to see what he had in front of him. Now I can recognize heroin and all the works when I see him. Needle, spoon, all that stuff. But this guy had a little knife there, a small brass cup, and I realize the snake isn't moving. It's not moving because he doesn't have a head, and the contents of his arteries had been drained into this little brass cup. This guy was doing heroin while drinking snake blood. And that's about the time I realized this wasn't just some party house. Much creepier stuff entirely was going on in there. So right as I'm shouting, "I think I'm just gonna try my luck on the road," over the music, the two girls are like, "Nah, we'll get your directions, but we're gonna have to go see Pazuzu." I respond, "Who's Pazuzu?" And in response, one of the girls just laughs. Not like in a, "that's a dumb question" kind of way, but more like, "Oh, you're not gonna like it when you find out" kind of way. So instantly, I have this knot of apprehension in my gut that's telling me to run away from that house and never, ever look back. But another factor at work was pure curiosity. I'd never seen anything like that house in my entire life. It was surreal in the extreme, the kind of place you'd never believe existed until you actually were in it. Put it this way, you'd think the idea of a corridor would be to allow free movement around a building. But no, in this house, the corridors were like the collective trash can. Me and the girls were literally clambering over freaking broken furniture, old fast food bags, all kinds of nonsense, just to make it to one of the house's bedrooms. One of the doors, I think it led to the bathroom, was literally covered in writing that started off like, "If you're reading this warning is for you." It went on to say all this stuff about wasting your life, being stuck with an empty life somewhere reading graffiti on a bathroom door, instead of doing anything more fulfilling. I was half lost in it when one of the girls was like, "Hey kid, you want your directions or no?" and since I wanted nothing more than to be out of there by that point, I was almost gagging from the smell. I wasted no time in following. As it turned out, the room this Pazuzu character was in was only accessible by passing the entrance to the basement. As I'm scrambling over some of the hallway debris right next to the basement entrance, this wave of rotten stench just overwhelms my nostrils, and I find myself actually retching from it. And not like a quiet little gag that I can at least attempt to hide. I'm talking like a loud, puke, screaming kind of deal. The girls just burst out laughing, telling me to man the F up because it's only cat litter or something. Let me assure you, I knew that wasn't just litter. It smelled like their cat had died rather than just taking a poop. I'm still retching as I step into what had to be the filthiest room in the house, which was honestly something of an achievement at that point. But unlike the other rooms where a kind of chaotic untidiness was the general theme, the filth in this room seemed to be cultivated. Most of the floor space was free, but I swear to God, the carpet was so dirty and crusty that it was almost like walking on gravel. That, and there was this patch of black mold on the ceiling that was the worst I've ever seen, even all these years later. It was unreal, and I'm just drinking this all in as I manage to get my retching in control, just in time to lay my eyes on one of the scariest individuals I've ever encountered. This guy had shoulder-length dreads sticking out of what I was pretty sure was a turban, and coupled with all the Arabic writing everywhere, I figured this guy was of some Muslim heritage or something. I didn't know many Muslims with face tattoos though, and I'm pretty sure anybody involved with that culture with the word Satan tattooed on their forearm would probably catch a stink eye or two for that. But as my mama said, the fastest way to offend a host is to talk politics or religion, so I decided to keep any questions to myself. Besides, the only one I was interested in was how to get to the North Carolina-Virginia state line. Right as I was about to ask, one of the girls spoke up for me. "Pazuzu, this guy has a question for you." The dude they called Pazuzu had these slow, kind of lazy movements, and as he looked at me behind his shades, I didn't need to see his eyes to know that he too was high as a kite. "Sit," was all he said. I'm good," I remember saying back to him. "'Cause it's dirty?" No, my back's been hollering at me is all." Clearly it was a lie that I said, but my desire not to offend the guy was suddenly waning. "But, it smells like someone died out there, dude. Maybe you should, clean up a little." This prompted yet more laughter from Pazuzu, the girls lounging around the room as well as the pair I'd followed. But the joke is completely lost on me, like I'm a kid who just said the dumbest thing ever but doesn't realize it yet. "Oh, that, right," the Pazuzu guy said. "Don't pay it no mind. There are just the bodies in the basement." More laughter now. The girls are laughing like it's the funniest thing they'd ever heard. Then, the Pazuzu guy spoke again. "You know how cleanliness is next to godliness, right? Well, filth is the path to demonhood. All this rot, all this decay." Right then he takes this big sniff of air like it was pure air freshener he was smelling. "All this filth, it gives me power." That's when he takes his shades off. And I swear to God, the scariest thing about this guy was his eyes. Even in the low light, I could see that they were pale, like a blue-gray kind of color. I just remember how dead they looked, like they were that color because all the life had been drained out of them or something, and even though he was smiling at me, his eyes had this sad look to them. The longer I stood there, listening to that guy talking all this nonsense, I started getting the impression that I'm not actually safe there. Like, yeah, it was a crazy-looking place, but the most dangerous party houses tend to get is the risk of being puked on or something. So I thought. I've been to party houses before, but I'd never gotten this overwhelming impression that my life was in danger, and not just from picking up a disease from all the gross stuff around the house. Actually, dude, I was hoping I could get some directions back to the highway. My phone died and He cut me off with, "You should stay. I think we can use you for something." Use me? Use me? Hearing those words made me freeze up for a moment. The girls around us started nodding and agreeing and stuff, and by this point I can actually feel the adrenaline kicking in. And that's because I just noticed the .22 rimfire that was leaning on the back of the couch him and his girls were sitting on. "Nah, I'm good. I got work in the morning." I'm already backing up while I'm saying this. "In fact, it's getting pretty late as it is. I should probably get going. Thanks anyway, though, and, cool house." When I turned, I half expected to see one of the girls blocking the doorway like it was some horror movie or something. But thank God it was clear. So I mount the trash pile in the corridor and start heading back towards the front door. "Don't you want directions, kid?" Even over the blaring music, I could hear one of the girls coming after me. Not chasing or anything, just following. But good God, that was creepy enough as it was. She follows me all the way back to my car, and as I climbed in the passenger seat, I could see that a bunch of people had come out onto the steps to watch me leave. And let me tell you, they did not look happy to see me go. It took me longer than it should, but eventually I find my way back to the highway, and I make it home late, but in one piece. The first thing I do is tell my mom and dad about the absolute insanity I stumbled into on the way home. They'd been pretty worried anyway, and to hear about all the weird devil stuff going on freaked them out. They told me to never go to that little town again, adding they'd give me some extra money for one of those in-car cell phone chargers that fits in the cigarette lighter if it ever came to it. I told a few other people about the house over the months that followed, but I'm pretty sure most people thought that I was just making up stuff. And I get it. It's the kind of thing you gotta see if you're ever gonna believe it. So as crazy as it is, it was all totally forgotten about by around Thanksgiving time. Then, I think just over a year after the whole thing happened, I'm living in an apartment down in Charlotte, working full-time as a painter at the shop. I finish work, get home, and start eating my dinner in front of the TV. The news comes on, starts talking about some murder or something, and that's when I hear a word that never in a million years did I ever think I'd hear again. Pazuzu. The moment the news lady said it, my head comes up like a deer hearing a twig snap. And when I looked at the TV, I almost spit out the mouthful of short ribs I was chewing on. It was the dreadlock guy with the tattooed face I'd seen the year before, and the one I was pretty sure wasn't kidding when he said he had a body in his basement. There had been a body in the basement, only it wasn't some raccoon that had gotten trapped in a crawl space or something. They'd locked a kid in the basement, starved him, shot him in the head, then covered his body with cat litter and bleach to minimize the smell. Then they showed one of the other people that had been arrested for the murder, and if it wasn't one of the girls with him that appeared on the screen, some blonde girl with no eyebrows who helped him kill the guy, according to the news report. By the time I was able to snap out of the pure shock of seeing all this, I grabbed my phone, called up a buddy of mine, one who rolled his eyes at my story and was like, "Turn on channel 9, like right now." He sounds all irritated like I just woke him up from a nap or something. Then I hear TV noises in the background. Then he just goes, "Oh my sweet Mother Mary." Y'all can look this guy up if you want. He had a Christian name when he was younger, but he was going by Pazuzu Algarad by the time he was arrested for murder. ended up hanging himself in a prison cell, I heard. It was a pretty messed up story. But knowing what he meant by, "You should stay, we could use you," that's what really haunts me about the whole thing. All I cared about was getting out of there and saving my own self. I didn't stop to think that other people might be in danger. It just seemed like he was crying out for attention, what with all those face tattoos and stuff, but to think he was actually capable of murder. Sometimes I find myself just counting my blessings and thanking God I didn't end up in that basement, covered in cat litter and bleach. I grew up in South London, the only daughter of 2 doctors from northwest Pakistan. For those of you that don't know, the federally administered tribal area is one of the wildest, most lawless places in all of Asia, and probably all the world too. The reason being is that it borders war-torn Afghanistan. Fighters, weapons, opium, and amphetamines all flow freely over the border that no government has been able to properly secure, meaning that Northwest Pak is where a lot of Taliban fighters hide out when they're not fighting NATO on the Afghan side of the border. Northwest Pakistan is also where my entire extended family are from, and in November 2017, we were invited to a wedding in their tribal village of Ghanem Shah. My older brother had been back to Pakistan when he was about 5 or 6, but the wedding would be my first time ever. I was a bit anxious about the long flight, but definitely really excited to meet my extended family for the first time. I'd spoken to my aunts and uncles on the phone and stuff, and I'd never met them in the flesh. And even for a 21st century girl like myself, I understood the importance of family, even if they were on the opposite side of the world. So we landed in Islamabad, where my dad rented a minivan for the 5-hour drive to Ghanem Shah. The company we got the van from offered to assign us a driver who knew the local area, but my dad, being the man he was, he insisted he doesn't even need a sat-nav to get us to his home village. What kind of Karlani would I be if I couldn't find the village of my birth? My mom knew better than to argue with him when his ego was in play, so we all just shut up and piled into the minivan. The roads weren't all that bad for the first hour or so. With Islamabad being the capital of Pakistan, you'd expect them to pour money into infrastructure in their immediate vicinity. But the closer and closer we got to Ghanem Shah, the more the minibus lurched and rocked on those horribly neglected dirt roads. Then, at around hour 3, we came to a fork in the road, and my dad is clearly hesitating. He'd never admit in a million years, but he clearly has no idea which way to go. And the Maps app on his phone is clearly not giving him good enough answers. In the end, he just made a decision and committed to it. After half an hour later, this big compound comes into view, and I ask my mom if this is the place. She says no, then says something to my dad, who responds with, "Bloody hell, woman, I'll get out and ask directions then." So we continue down this dirt path towards the big mud brick walls of the compound. About halfway up, there's a little shack off of the road, and one that didn't look occupied until I see a younger man burst from the opening, hurtling towards our truck in what looked like an attempt to cut us off before you reach the gates to this compound. I'm like, "Mom, does that man have a gun?" She looks, and all of a sudden starts shouting, Ahmad, stop the bloody car!" yelling at my dad. Then all I hear is bang, bang, bang as the man started shooting at our car. I knew people could be unfriendly to strangers in the Fatah, but this was worse than anything I'd expected. My dad turns us around and speeds back the way we came. Thankfully, the gunman didn't shoot at us anymore. A short time later, we do actually find our family's compound. We settle in, meet and greet everyone, then all the women get to work making a big family-sized meal for the evening. Then get this. The same bloke that had been shooting at us shows up at the compound, only this time, he had an apology for us. You see, he was guarding the house of a man who controlled like a quarter of all the opium fields in Nangarhar province over the border in Afghanistan. The Pakistani government were always coming after him, so much so that he'd had someone plant a landmine on the track to his house. The guy hadn't been shooting at us. He'd been firing warning shots once he realized we weren't pack special forces or whatever, since he didn't want to see us blow up. It was one heck of a way to kick off the trip, and I was terrified that something even worse might happen over the course of the wedding. But alhamdulillah, nothing else happened, and we all made it back home safe and sound. But I'll tell you what, I've never felt so lucky to be born in a place where war is a distant memory for most people, because I honestly couldn't imagine all that bullets, bombs, or drugs being part of my daily life. I've been taking part in long-distance hikes and rambles ever since I was about 22. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's never, ever ask a man for directions. Or rather, only ever ask a bloke when there's no women to ask. You see, if you ask a woman for directions and she doesn't know the answer, she'll just say, "Sorry, love, can't help you, best of luck." And she moves on. However, ask a bloke the exact same question, and they find it completely impossible to just admit they don't know. So rather than just holding their hands up and apologizing, a bloke would rather send you on some ridiculous detour. They couldn't give a toss if they get you lost, as long as they looked like they knew what they were talking about. And this is how we ended up wandering onto a country estate in the middle of nowhere, where one of the most terrifying and shocking events of my life would occur. We were all up in Scotland at the time, 6 of us on a hiking trip that would span the length of Hadrian's Wall. We tried to stock up on food and water at little villages we came across along the day, but by day 5, we were down on our end of rations, and we were definitely craving a bit of fresh meat. So, me and this guy Barry decided that we'll just use the rest of our daylight wisely and make a run into the nearest town or village so we can pick up a few choice items. We collected a few quid of everyone, packed a day sack, then headed off to grab supplies. We think we're headed pretty much in the right direction, but when a tractor appeared on the little country lane ahead, we decided to flag it down to ask directions. The farmer was a nice enough fellow, even informing us that he had a shortcut for us that would save us maybe an hour or two of walking. Jackpot, we're thinking. We might even be back for a quick bacon supper before we all headed off to bed. So, we listen carefully as the bloke tells us to cut through a wooded area about a mile down the road. If we stay on the paths, we'll come out into a wee village with a farm shop that stayed open until fairly late in the evening. Farm shop. If ever there was a word to make me salivate, it's that. I'm not sure if they have them over in the States, but over here, farm shops are a mainstay of any rural area. It's there you find the very best of a farmer's produce, the kind of things that even the most high-end supermarkets would blush over. Pork and apple sausages, fresh fillets of corn-fed chicken. Some of them even brew their own wines or beers. And I'd be lying if I said that that last thing wasn't the biggest motivating factor of all. But anyway, so we follow this guy's directions to the letter. But we still end up so hopelessly lost that I was honestly wondering if we'd had some kind of brain fart along the way. We must have walked for 20 minutes through this wooded area, always sticking to the path, but when we came out of it, there was not a single man-made building to be seen anywhere, let alone an entire village. Me and Barry are looking at each other like, what have we gotten ourselves into here? But since there was another patch of woodland off in the distance, we figured he must have meant walk through that bit too. No big drama, so we head up towards this next set of trees. About 5 minutes in, we start losing the path in front of us to the woods. It's clearly there, but it's just overgrown to the extent that we might as well have been walking through solid woodland. Suddenly, I just hear Barry hiss in a low but urgent tone. "Lad, look." In front of us, trotting through the woodland, seemingly totally unaware of our presence, is a deer. Now, we were real city kids, like inner-city concrete jungle through and through. I'm the kind of guy who will stop to look at a police horse in the middle of a Saturday night, just stood there waxing lyrical like the magnificence, the grace, the wild, unbridled spirit. All the while, it takes a massive dump onto a pile of empty takeaway boxes. So, needless to say, seeing that deer was like we'd wandered into the middle of a David Attenborough documentary. I'm not even joking. It was truly an amazing sight. Very majestic. We were stood there still as statues, just properly in awe of this thing, before it suddenly notices us and freezes in turn. Like most daft city kids my age, the first thing I think of is to go for my phone because, obviously, photos or it didn't happen. I'm pretty sure Barry's doing the same thing as the deer suddenly takes a few curious steps towards us, sniffing the air as if it was wondering what we were. Now it's even closer. Now it's as if it's saying, "Go on, take a picture. I'll even strike a pose for you. Vogue, vogue, vogue." Then right as I get a grip of my phone in my oversized hiking pants pocket, the deer's head explodes. At least, I can only theorize that it did, because the only real sense I got was when I saw a split second of the deer's head disintegrating before all these hot, wet droplets of something splattered all over my face. Obviously, in my shock, my first move is to wipe my hands with my face, which is when I notice that not everything that's just hit my face is liquid. I bring my hands away from my face, open my eyes, and all I can see is smeared blood and chunks of what I later discovered were probably bone fragments. I look over at Barry, who doesn't have nearly as much gore on him as me, and almost at the same time, each of us let out a bellowing scream. All of a sudden, we hear something else moving through the trees just off from where we're stood. We were about ready to leg it by that point, but before either of us could call it, some bloke in a barber jacket and a flat cap emerges from the trees, locks eyes with us, and says in the poshest voice I've ever heard, "Gentlemen, I'm so terribly sorry. I didn't have the foggiest idea either of you were there. Let me offer my sincerest apologies for giving you such a ghastly fright. Dear, dear, what an awful mess I've made of you." Then, another bloke appears, slightly older with a beard but similarly dressed. This time, he's got about the thickest Scottish accent I've ever heard, a broke-barrel shotgun under his arm, and he starts having a go at us like, "Pair of bums, you can just saunter on the private land like that. You're lucky and shoot you." The posh bloke is like, "No, now, Fraser, that's quite enough of that," and then continues to apologize to us. Turns out, we wandered right onto this bloke's land, who just so happened to be the lord of such and such a place, like a proper old landed gentry type who still was hunting on his land. He was nice enough to give us a lift up to his manor, the details of which would probably make a whole other story on its own. He let us wash all the blood and brains on us in one of his ridiculously opulent bathrooms. Marble fixtures, huge fancy mirrors, the lot. I had never been anywhere so posh, and there I was trying to make sure I didn't leave any deer brains on this fella's gold-plated bathroom features. It was honestly an insane experience. When we were done, the older Scottish bloke gave us a lift into town in his Land Rover, paid for our supplies on his boss's card, then drove us back towards where we were camped out for the night. When our hiking companion saw us jumping up out of a top-of-the-line 4x4, the first question was, "Who is that?" Barry's response summed up the entire incident. "Oh, him? Just the bloke that nearly shot us. Nice enough fella, though. Bought us some bacon." In April of 2011, British tourists James Coops Cooper and James Jam Kuzaris were enjoying a transatlantic vacation in the sunny state of Florida. 25-year-old Coops and 24-year-old Jam had first met at the University of Sheffield in 2005, when both were fresh-faced first-year students. According to friends, they'd struck up an almost instant friendship upon meeting, one which would continue throughout their student years and well into their mid-20s. The pair had apparently traveled together before, and as anyone who's been on vacation with a close friend before will tell you, if you don't end up murdering the person by the end of the trip, it's evidently a friendship that'll last a lifetime. And that's exactly what kind of friendship Coops and Jam had. Like most of the nights they spent in Florida, Jam and Coops whiled away the midnight hours by drinking beers, munching down the exquisite seafood of Sarasota, and generally being typically British in a place that defines the United States in so many different ways. The night of April 15th was no different, and as the late night ticked over into the early morning, Jam and Coops decided they better call it a night. They thanked the staff of whatever bar they were in, then proceeded to walk back in the direction of their hotel. But in reality, navigating their way through the dark Sarasota streets proved much easier said than done, and it wasn't long before Jam and Coops were stumbling along alleys and avenues that they didn't recognize. Not that it was a problem for either of them. Witnesses say that they were laughing and joking as they walked, spirits high due to the fine weather and strong alcohol. How could they know that their night was about to plunge from a giddy high to a terrifying low? How could they know that their night was about to plunge from a giddy high to a terrifying low? How could they possibly know that wandering into the Newtown neighborhood of Sarasota will be the single worst mistake of their lives? As Jam and Coops continued to stumble through the muggy Florida night, they heard a voice from behind calling out to them. It was a 16-year-old boy named Sean Tyson, who had apparently heard the two men's accents and had been following out of simple curiosity at first. But Tyson's intentions had quickly shifted from a harmless curiosity to those of an opportunistic predator. He wasn't quite sure where the men were from, but he recognized that they were both very, very drunk. Despite just being 16 years old, Sean was an experienced stick-up artist and often carried a .22 revolver for the explicit purpose of relieving the unwary of their valuables. Some of his neighbors even said he was fond of firing off rounds into the air as a way of both celebrating and intimidating. Upon seeing the young man, it's entirely possible that the drunk and jolly Coop and James would have thought they'd simply made a new friend, a new traveling companion, and someone that could possibly point them in the direction of their motel. But Sean Tyson didn't want any new friends. He wanted their money, and he wasn't shy about letting them know it. At first, the two Brits thought he was asking for money, and they were more than willing to lend him some. They were flat broke from their night of drinking, and they did have a few dollars in change to hand over. But that wasn't enough for Sean. He wanted large bills, he wanted their phones and wallets, and he wanted them handed over fast. It's only then that he produced the handgun, something that let the two friends know that he wasn't messing around. It had the exact reaction he intended it to have. In the UK, it's not straight up impossible to own a firearm, but the government and police make it so expensive and bureaucratically irritating that most people who begin the process give up trying to obtain one. So, generally speaking, when a non-military, non-law enforcement British person sees a firearm, it can provoke a deep reaction of awe, surprise, or even fear. And when Jam and Coop saw the revolver in Sean's hand, any potential fight that might have been in them evaporated entirely. Again, Sean determined that the now terrified friends hand over their cash, but there was a problem. It seems that both men had swapped a large amount of British currency for US dollars at the very start of their trip. This would serve as their budget and ensure they didn't overspend. Any other money in their possession was back in their hotel room, the same hotel they were struggling to find in their drunken state. Jam and Coops must have been absolutely terrified as they tried to explain this to young Sean, offering up their phones and other valuables in substitute. Sean took them without so much as a second thought, but didn't believe for a second that the two were strapped for cash. To them, they were tourists, walking dollar signs who were just holding out on him. To the two British tourists, the interaction was surreal in the extreme. They were on holiday, according to the parlance, on break from their dreary lives back in the UK. They weren't wrapped up in the subtleties of US gun laws, nor were they aware of the risk it would incur. All they had to do was show their prospective robber that they had no money. After that, all they had to do was extract themselves from the volatile situation. Walk away. Just walk away. It's what we're told to do when conflict arises, But what do you do when that conflict chooses to follow? Because that's exactly what Sean did on that humid Florida night. He followed Jam and Coops, revolver in hand, demanding they turn over their non-existent cash. We can only imagine how terrified the two of them must have been, faced with the kind of threat that would be almost alien to them, a nightmare that had become a tangible reality. The point at which Sean Tyson lost his patience with the men is unclear, but we can be quite clear that he had been following Jam and Coops for quite some time before he finally decided to act. According to his line of thinking, they were lying to him, trying to punk him. Tourists were made of money, and the two in front of him just needed proper motivation to hand over their cash. "Since you don't have any money," Tyson said, approaching Coops from the rear, "I got something for you." Tyson thrust the barrel of the .22 revolver into Coops' side and pulled the trigger. The bullet ripped through his liver, kidneys, and intestines, a kind of horrendous penetrative pain that the young Brit had never felt before in his life. Coops' knees buckled almost as soon as the trigger had been pulled, a grunt of pain escaping him as he hit the concrete. For Jam, the terrifying reality of the situation hit him like a ton of bricks. This complete stranger, this young man that seemed no older than a teenager, he just mortally wounded Jam's best friend in the world. All he could think to do was beg for his life, collapsing to his knees beside his wounded friend whilst looking up at their attacker. "Please, mate, we're just on holiday," he's believed to have said. "We're drunk. We don't have any money. Just please don't kill us, please." Tears formed in the young man's eyes as his friend writhed in pain on the concrete. At this point, Sean Tyson must have expected the pair of friends to give up whatever money they had stashed away. Only, they didn't. The unhurt of the two simply begged for his life. Only then did it really occur to Sean that they had been telling the truth the entire time. We can only assume that to an experienced stick-up kid like Sean, this was nothing short of an embarrassment. His instincts had been entirely wrong. He wasn't going to make any worthwhile cash out of it, and what's worse, he had an attempted murder beef coupled with a witness who had seen his face, heard his voice. He even knew which neighborhood police could find him in. There was only one way the encounter could end, and that was with Sean being the only person that walked away from it. And so, with his victim still begging for his life, Sean Tyson raised the revolver, aimed it at Jam's head, and pulled the trigger. He emptied his remaining 4 shots into the chests of each man, finishing them off. Then, soundtracked by a chorus of barking dogs, Sean Taylor picked up the shell casings that were lying on the tarmac, but he wasn't quite done yet. Sean proceeded to pull off the 2 men's blood-stained t-shirts, as well as pull their trousers down to their knees. It's not clear why he did this. Some believe it was a way of humiliating the 2 Brits in death. Others seem to think it was a last-ditch effort to locate any hidden cash either of the men were in possession of. But what's self-evident is that when the cops finally arrived on scene, the street looked more like the site of an execution than a robbery gone wrong. In the hours following the shooting, Sean gave the shell casings and the murder weapon to a close friend of his, instructing him to bury both in his backyard. However, instead of following the instructions, Jermaine Bain then sold the revolver for $50. This would prove to be their undoing as police traced the gun back to him, and also the shell casings. When the cops threatened to charge him with murder, Jermaine rolled on his buddy, telling the cops that Sean had been the one to kill the 2 British tourists. Sean, who was tried as an adult at Sarasota County Court, despite having been just 16 at the time of the murders, was given 2 life sentences without the eligibility of parole. Before sentence was passed, 2 of the British pair's friends read out impact statements to the court. "For every painful detail of their deaths I have endured, for each disturbing photo I've been exposed to, I'm still glad I have this opportunity to look into your eyes and try to explain the pain that you have caused." Joe Hallett, a friend of the pair's, explained. "Every night you go to sleep, every morning you wake up, I want you to think of my friends who you murdered. They will. haunt you. In the early hours of Sunday, September 17th of 1995, 25-year-old Timothy Stone was driving his young family back from a cookout in their native city of Los Angeles. Also in the car were his 26-year-old partner, Robin Cohen, her 5-year-old son, Christopher, and her 3-year-old daughter, Stephanie, and their 2-year-old brother, Joseph. Timothy wasn't all that familiar with the Cypress Park neighborhood they were driving through, and given that it was almost 2 o'clock in the morning, he hardly had the best view of his immediate surroundings. And what was worse, many of the streetlights seemed to have been shot out. At a fork in the road, Timothy turned onto the 2000 block of Isabel Street, a dark, narrow, dead-end alley that was covered in gang-related graffiti, including one piece that read, Avenida de los Asesinos, the Street of Killers. Timothy had taken a wrong turn, one that would take him and his young family into one of the most dangerous places in the whole of California, the territory of a street gang known as El Avenidas. Notorious as LA's most violent Latino gangster sets, the Avenues, as they're better known as, have a long history of involvement with the Mexican mafia. Respect, loyalty, and secrecy are the cornerstones of their savage belief system, while any challenge to their authority, both real or perceived, is met with swift and brutal displays of ferocity. So, when up to 20 members of La Avs saw an unknown vehicle headed through the heart of their well-defined territory, they saw it as both a direct threat and a direct challenge to their reign. The Avenue Gang are also infamous for their participation in anti-black hate crimes against innocent African-American inhabitants of their neighborhoods. Their violence grew so prolific and hateful at one point that some called their actions a campaign of ethnic cleansing directed at honest, hard-working members of the black community here in Los Angeles. However, when gang members surrounded the vehicle, it would be abundantly clear that Timothy and his family were no rival gangsters or undercover cops. Not only did they appear to be a straight-laced Caucasian couple, but the inclusion of multiple children in the car precluded the possibility of it being some kind of law enforcement operation. Timothy and Robin must have been absolutely terrified as the first of several trash cans smashed into their vehicle. This seems to have been the gang member's way of telling Timothy to back off, and he swiftly began to make a rather erratic U-turn. Only, rather than simply letting the family leave, others threw large steel trash cans in front of their wheels, slowing them long enough for a group of gangsters to completely surround the terrified family. Both Timothy and Robin begged for the men to let them go, but they refused until they received a satisfactory answer to their questions of why the couple was in their barrio, or neighborhood. Timothy simply apologized over and over again, but it was no good. One of the gang members produced a pistol, aimed it at Timothy's face, and threatened to pull the trigger. In a complete panic, Timothy simply put his foot down, plowing into the human roadblock in the hopes that they could make a sudden escape. More than one of the gang was wielding a firearm by that point, and when the front end of Timothy's car smashed into them, they emptied their weapons into the windshield, sending round after round ripping through both flesh and upholstery alike. One bullet struck 3-year-old Stephanie in the head as she lay in her mother's arms. Her 2-year-old brother Joseph was hit in the left foot, and a bullet grazed the flesh of Timothy's back. The family rushed to the hospital, hoping that the lives of their young children could be saved. Joseph made nothing short of a full recovery, but young Stephanie was unable to be revived, passing away just a few hours later, her broken-hearted parents just a few feet away behind a closed door when her time of death was called. The murder sparked widespread anger and outrage, with former President Clinton summing up the national spirit by saying, "A family took one wrong turn, and because they were in the wrong place, gang members felt that they had the right to shoot at them and take their lives and kill an innocent child." Many wondered how such a horrifically senseless killing could occur in the first place, and as journalists descended on Cypress Park, the public began to learn of the pure horror endured by the neighborhood's residents on a daily basis. Not only were innocent people losing their lives in the crossfire of rampant gang warfare, but the hideous initiation rites of the gang's new members often involved them gunning down civilians in order to prove their loyalty. Cypress Park was a place where a run to the corner store for a carton of milk could mean losing your life, and for no reason other than you were randomly selected for death. Many Americans couldn't believe this was happening in the same country as them, but for others, it was the reality that greeted them every time they walked out into the street. Stephanie Cohen was laid to rest a week later. A dozen Los Angeles police officers served as honor guard, with 4 generations of the Cohen family filling the small stone church of the Recessional in Glendale, where cousin Michael Fanning referred to Stephanie as God's little angel. At the time of the service, the search for her killers was almost drawing to a close. They had profiles on all of the gang members local to that particular area of Cypress Park. All they needed to do was find the triggermen. Not long after, 28-year-old Anthony Gabriel Rodriguez, 22-year-old Manuel Rosales Jr., and 18-year-old Hugo David Gomez were arrested and charged with the attack on a terrified young family that was simply unfortunate enough to have made a wrong turn on a dark night. At the end of their trial on August 1st, 1997, a judge sentenced all 3 to 54 years to life in state prison, to be served in separate penitentiaries on opposite sides of California. The American people breathed a collective sigh of relief as the news that Stephanie's killers had been brought to justice. Yet since then, the nation has struggled with the violent gang activity that plagues most of its major metropolitan areas. With St. Louis and Baltimore boasting a murder rate almost double that of other cities, surely it's only a matter of time before another innocent family, both local and non-local, are unlucky enough to make a wrong turn that ends in their brutal, merciless execution. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data. Located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links down below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.